Prime then adds that until they get more definitive info, they are going to wait, but he will go and speak with, quote-unquote, the only other Autobot who can fly in space, Omega Supreme. We then see Prime, rather confusingly, head into a forest where he kind of just summons Omega Supreme, Andy. He just sort of calls out to him and then Omega Supreme just appears.
Yeah, I mean, the intimation seems to be that Omega Supreme is hiding, and it's like, well, how does I mean, that's literally what I wrote in my notes. How does Omega Supreme hide? Because, like, he's absolutely massive. I mean, this is, even compared to sending Jetfire in on a stealth mission, this is like, well, how do you, even in a forest, you're going to struggle to hide for long.
I mean, I would probably just raise the question of how does Laserbeak constantly get into Autobot HQ?
Well, yeah, that is...
It feels like one of those everlasting questions.
Indeed.
Once Prime has found Omega Supreme, he relays the details of what is occurring, saying that they may need his help. Omega Supreme, though, isn't interested in this, until he hears Optimus Prime specifically mention the Constructicons, and says, very directly to Prime, Constructicons, enemy. Enemies, die. A bit much at this point, to be fair.
Which, I mean, that's fair for Decepticons, but yeah, definitely riled him a little bit.
We come to find out that there has seemingly been a bit of a personal issue between Omega Supreme and the Constructicons. Prime tries to get him to tell him what's happened, but he won't. Question, irrelevant. Matter, private, says Omega Supreme. The best dialogue. But given that Prime is the Autobot leader, when he says that he wants to know what's happened, Omega Supreme relents, sits down like he's having a picnic or something, and begins to tell Prime. Now, interesting, Andy, and I want to add this a note before we go any further, because it's a fun little tidbit. Prime asks if Omega Supreme can talk like a normal Autobot, which really caught me off guard rather than the stilted dialogue. And Omega Supreme says just this once, he will talk like he did on Cybertron before the betrayal, quote-unquote. Would you like a fun fact about why he speaks in this way?
Yeah, go for it. Hit me.
So, according to the Transformers wiki, full credit here, the uncharacteristic eloquence displayed by Omega Supreme in this episode was actually the result of an error by writer David Wise, who was unaware of Omega's normal speech pattern and scripted the episode with normal dialogue. Dialogue editors were forced to insert Optimus Prime's request for Omega to talk like a normal Autobot to make this flashback sequence work.
To be fair, if I was the writer of this episode, I would also forget, quote-unquote, that Omega Supreme spoke that way, given that he's having to narrate the entire episode. It's like, no, I'm not writing an entire episode in, 2-word, single-syllable sentences. I'm not doing it. You can't make me. I'm just going to write him normally. Because, I mean, to be honest, it really makes sense in terms of actually putting this story across, because it would be interminable to have to watch the entire episode with Omega Supreme trying to narrate it like that. So having him just be like, all right, yeah, I'll just talk normal, is kind of the most sensible thing that I think you could do with this. So deliberate or accidental, kudos for probably actually making the right decision.
So before we get into the flashback itself, Andy, so far, set up for the episode, what are you thinking at this point while watching it?
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, it's kind of, you're pretty typical, grab the energy source of the week on one side, but then it quickly becomes clear that that's kind of just an excuse to get to the meat of the story. Again, it's like, well, this has been the thing we've seen in a few episodes now, where things are set in space mostly just so that Omega Supreme can get involved, because, as mentioned, he's one of the few Autobots that can fly in space. So yeah, but I mean, I was definitely into, I mean, how many times have we mentioned, like, oh, it's really annoying how this major character has just been dumped into the show without any exposition about why he's there or who he is or anything. And kind of like double ears pricking up about also the Constructicons, who we kind of had a similar beef with, that they would, they just appeared, and we kind of made up our own headcanon of where they came from and assumed that they were, built on Earth like the Dinobots, but apparently not, as we will come to discover.
We'll come back to that point about the Constructicons' origin, because what we're about to talk about certainly adds to the origin. It also creates a potentially glaring continuity issue from a previous episode. We'll get into that. So, we see the story unfold before our eyes in the form of a flashback with, as you alluded to, Andy, both Prime and Omega Supreme adding additional narration for context as we go. We find out that Omega Supreme was once one of the Guardian robots of Crystal City on Cybertron. This was a fact actually that even Prime himself wasn't aware of, but remembered Crystal City and described it as being the most spectacular city on Cybertron. Omega Supreme say he loved the place. As Omega is walking back to the city after what I've eloquently put, Andy, as a doctor's checkup, because it's a weird thing to imagine, a doctor giving Omega Supreme a physical or whatnot. The Constructicons arrived to do maintenance on some foundations. We find out that they were not only friends of Omega Supreme, but they also built Crystal City. However, Megatron is waiting nearby in the wings, so to speak, with a new robot he has constructed called Robo Smasher.
Like, cued us to Megatron for the naming there. Like, we've made a lot of fun of names of things in the show, but if you're going to do something evil, why not call your machine the Robo Smasher?
It's a great name.
Fantastic.
It's a great name. And it's a machine that immobilizes and reprograms Transformers for Megatron's uses, increasing his forces. Based on what we see, though the Constructicons have actually got Decepticon emblems on them at this point in the flashback, they are in fact good at this point, so that muddies the waters quite a bit. But Megatron alludes to the fact he wants to use Robo Smasher to reprogram them. Omega is on guard duty, so to speak, and the Constructicons head inside to do their maintenance. Omega narrating what happens next he wasn't aware of for a few hours. The Constructicons are inside, but they encounter a locked door, which you'd think if they're frickin' Constructicons, they might be able to open a frickin' locked door, but that's beside the point. They are then ambushed by Megatron and Robo Smasher, and we are assumed they are reprogrammed. Outside, seemingly a bit later in the day, the Constructicons arrive and tell Omega Supreme the capital city is being attacked, and help is needed urgently. Omega is conflicted about this because he's meant to be guarding Crystal City and he can't just leave his post, but the Constructicons say they will guard Crystal City in his place while he goes to help. It turns out there was no attack in the capital city, and Omega Supreme arrives back to Crystal City, seeing it being knocked down and harvested for crystals by the Constructicons. At this point in the episode, Andy, we've got a commercial break, so I think this might be a good time to sort of just discuss maybe a few bits and bobs of the flashback so far. I am loving this flashback story. It's so good, and the fact we see more of Cybertron, we get to see a different side of Omega Supreme I actually don't think I was aware of, despite kind of being sure I've seen this episode before. Child Jeremy must have just forgot it, but I am loving the whole build behind, just the whole build-up of the story, and it actually makes logical sense, everything they're telling so far, barring the fact that the Constructicons have got Decepticon emblems on them.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always a big fan, as we've sort of discussed, of this show going back to Cybertron and getting to see a bit more of that, because it's really super interesting. There are quite a few things that kind of irk me about this story, like in contrast. Like the Decepticon emblem thing is particularly... That's a really weird one because It also irks me that, the Constructicons don't have kind of like Cybertron versions of their transformed modes.
Agreed.
Which is like, you think about like season 1, like, episode 1, season 1, you get those great kind of alternate modes of like Wheeljack and Bumblebee and the Seeker Jets. And, you get that with a few other characters like throughout, where you get to see what they were like when they transformed on Cybertron. And then the Constructicons, it's just like, oh, they're just still a dump truck and a cement mixer, because apparently, heavy plant equipment is exactly the same on both planets or something. Which is kind of disappointing. And then, the Decepticon emblem thing is really weird, because that doesn't even require additional design work. It's just like, tell the animators just to lop the logos off, and just make them neutral. I think the part of this that I kind of don't particularly like is the whole like Megatron Robo Smasher thing, because I feel like, especially when we've sort of, we had that like public education video in a previous episode about like the Autobot Decepticon war, that sort of made it sound like, it was a very sort of naturally occurring civil war that sort of, made sense and was kind of compelling. Whereas here it's just kind of like, Megatron just roamed around and sort of like forcibly reprogrammed people, and that was it. And I don't know, I just find that way less satisfying than what tends to be like the general plot point of Transformers, and like the war came about, because of a lack of energy and a sort of, political schism in terms of how to deal with that, or, whichever way you kind of swayed it, it was very much like people joined a side because they had beliefs and they had a reason to do it, rather than just like they were all forced to do it. Because it kind of recontextualized like all of the Decepticons of like, Starscream, Soundwave, the whole lot. Like, have they all just been reprogrammed? Because that's what this seems to be suggesting, which is kind of like just sort of inherently makes that less interesting to me than these people are fighting for Megatron for a good reason, or what they believe to be a good reason.
That's a very fair point, actually. I hadn't thought of it like that, and taking Starscream as an example, if we go back to the episode where they find Skyfire, and there's that initial moment where Skyfire is hanging around with Starscream as a Decepticon, and Starscream's like, it's great being a Decepticon, you get to blow up stuff, or whatever it was he said. It does completely change the context of a heck of a lot of that. It also makes you wonder, like you say, who's actually been reprogrammed?
Yeah. Or more likely that this was just something they wrote in for this episode and nobody considered it up until this point, which I suspect is what actually happened. But hey, if nothing else, at least we've already learned that the secret of Omega Supreme is that he's a gullible idiot. So, it's like we can write that one off right away.
As we come back from adverts, Omega Supreme says to Prime, the worst has yet to come. Which I've got to say, Andy, at that point I'm thinking, oh mate, you had a bad day.
Yeah, this is a very bad day at the office for Omega Supreme. It is fair to say.
Omega realises that this is all Megatron's doing and vows to save his friends and get revenge. He says that he tracked them for weeks and eventually is able to corner them, managing to trap them and begin restoring them each accordingly. With all of that seemingly completed and the Constructicons feeling sane, quote-unquote, again, they head back to Crystal City's location to begin rebuilding it. And honestly, Andy, that wasn't far-fetched, because based on what we've seen in other Transformers episodes, Transformers can build stuff really freaking quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
But they encounter Robo Smasher on the way, and this is when we discover that apparently Megatron's reprogramming via the Robo Smasher is permanent and can never be undone. But there was more. Before the reprogramming, the Constructicons were each to their own, but Megatron had given them a new combined form, Devastator. We then see Devastator holding Omega Supreme in place as Robo Smasher begins to try and reprogram Omega Supreme. Robo Smasher was able to begin the process, but Omega was able to break free, fainting, seemingly, in the process of that. The Constructicons scarper. As the flashback concludes, Omega Supreme says that the Robo Smasher did change him, in that he now only feels hate for the Constructicons. They fled Cybertron in a starship, and he followed them for millions of years across the galaxy. When they eventually found Megatron on Earth, he followed them to Earth as well. Thus, Andy, explaining how both the Constructicons and Omega Supreme ended up on Earth.
Yeah, and that does kind of like make sense, although as you mentioned, like that's not the story that we've had previously. Like I forget what we were previously led to believe around the Constructicons, but I'm pretty sure it was not that.
Yeah, so I'll finish this last bit of the story, as it were, but with the story concluded, Prime says that he wants Omega to stay here on Earth and take no action until he receives word from Prime. Message understood, Omega Supreme responds. So to put a pin on the conversation there for a second, the thing that does perhaps be a bit of it perhaps muddies the waters a bit is, like you mentioned, we were under the impression the Constructicons were made on Earth. The reason that I mentioned there is a continuity flaw here from a previous episode, in Desertion of the Dinobots, when the Decepticons are needing the Cybertonium, it was called, wasn't it? The substance they needed. Every single Transformer, barring the Dinobots, needed Cybertonium. If I recall, we don't actually see the Constructicons in those episodes, so we don't actually know for sure if they also needed Cybertonium. But based on that, shouldn't they need it as well?
Yeah. I mean, I guess that's the thing. The fact that we didn't see them, gives you an easy out. I mean, I'm sure they didn't plan far enough ahead to like deliberately leave them out just so that they could have this big reveal. But you never know. Stranger things have happened. So yeah, I guess that's kind of fine, and that works. That you can certainly argue. Again, sort of it's the weird thing, for me having come, because I thought I'd watched this episode in the past, but I don't think I had from seeing this. I don't think I ever saw this one. But it's like my sort of my Constructicon like lore from the comics is that they were very much constructed on Earth. So it's sort of it's kind of messes with my head a bit, the idea that they weren't. But yeah, I mean that all kind of adds up because they weren't in Desertion, which I couldn't remember whether they were or not. But I feel like at some point it's sort of been like it's sort of been suggested that they weren't from Cybertron, but I guess they've never really said like explicitly one way or the other, so they get a pass on that one.
But the flashback overall, though, again, we've got our differing points on what we feel about it, but I genuinely loved the entire story. I felt it actually really added a lot more to Omega Supreme, and the fact he's got this really strong hate for the Constructicons, it adds a whole new dynamic when you see them fighting each other at all now. Even like past fights where we've had little teasers of it, there's like a whole other, oh man, you really freaking hate them, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, it's a sort of interesting thing you can do with kind of characters in this sort of setup where you can have these kind of grudge matches, and like again, the comics were really good at having some of those, some of which were kind of obvious. It's like, I mean, in the UK comics, like Galvatron v Ultra Magnus was an obvious thing because it was two leaders, but also like it wasn't just like Optimus Prime and Megatron. Like Galvatron basically loses his mind and goes insane over the fact that he has to destroy Ultra Magnus, and spoilers, does repeatedly. But and I think it's like Megatron and Ratchet kind of turns into kind of this weird sort of rivalry where they don't actually kind of come face to face all that often in the comics, but there's this sort of thing that there's like a beef there between the two of them that's kind of interesting. So having that kind of thing always adds a little bit extra to proceedings. I do always like, I mean, much like the kind of Starscream and Skyfire thing, I do like that kind of like pre-war sort of Cybertron life of kind of like, oh no, like these guys used to be buddies and now they're on different sides of a conflict. Like, even though I don't necessarily like the way it's kind of pivots in this episode, like I still appreciate that, and it's kind of cute having the Constructicons and Omega Supreme having a nice chat of like, oh, how was your day? It was lovely. How was your day? Did you have a good weekend? And all of that, like, which is kind of like really sort of entertaining to see from a series that's normally just pew pew lasers and everybody trying to off one another.
Another part of the story I really enjoyed is it's the fact that Megatron is the one that created Devastator. I think that's a really nice touch to the story, just to add Megatron's dark side or darker side of what else could he do to like win a war type situation.
Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of thing that, you know, it would be a really, if you wanted to do like a sort of deep, dark kind of episode or story or comic or whatever around, would be really interesting, of just like, you know, the birth of Devastator and like maybe the mental effect that it has on the Constructicons. Because if it was a forced thing that they like have to combine, you know, and we've sort of seen like, you know, we've seen the Constructicons kind of being like a bit snarky at each other in other episodes. Like there's a really interesting thing you could do there with their kind of like, you know, having to share maybe the same mind space basically when they combine. But hey, I'm just here writing my own Transformers fan fiction, so I should probably stop.